I was halfway through mowing the back pasture when 3 police cruisers came roaring up my private drive, lights flashing like the 4th of July and sirens screaming loud enough to make the cattle bolt toward the fence, and for a split second, I thought someone had gotten hurt until one of the officers shouted for me to drop the mower and step away from the tractor because I was under arrest for trespassing on my own land, which was ironic considering I owned not only the land but the deed that half the HOA board had been trying to rewrite for months, and at that exact moment I realized they'd finally taken their stupidity too far. The scene was ridiculous enough that I laughed out loud, covered in dust and grass clippings, waving at the cop like an old friend as he tried to play serious, his radio crackling with orders from a voice that I immediately recognized as Karen, the self-declared HOA president who once fined me $50 because she claimed my fence paint clashed with community tones. I could see her through the open window of her silver SUV parked at the end of the drive, clutching her phone like it was a weapon, her face red with triumph, the kind of triumph only someone completely wrong can feel. I wiped my forehead and said something like, "Officer, I think you've been set up," but he cut me off, insisting I'd been reported for illegal use of community property, which made me grin even wider because this so-called community property was 37 acres of registered county land I'd inherited from my father, land that predated the HOA by nearly 70 years. That was the hook moment. The point when my patience finally snapped and I decided that if they wanted to play legal chess, they were about to realize the person they were challenging was the one who literally signed their citations into law every month. The situation began weeks earlier when the HOA held an emergency meeting about encroachment concerns. I hadn't even been invited, but my neighbor, old Mr. Carson, texted me a photo of the agenda with my name listed next to words like non-compliance and unauthorized development. Apparently, my barn renovation had stirred them up. The barn was ancient, built in the 1940s, and all I'd done was replace the roof and install a new drainage ditch that diverted water away from the HOA's new flower beds, yet Karen claimed it altered the visual harmony of the neighborhood. She'd been after me for months, showing up with her clipboard and plastic smile, warning me about bylaws that didn't even apply to my property. I'd tried to reason with her once, telling her politely that my land was outside their jurisdiction, but she responded with one of her classic lines. "Everything within the view of our community counts as part of the community." I'd nearly choked on my coffee laughing. Things escalated when she sent me a violation notice demanding I remove the barn entirely or face a fine of $10,000. I remember reading that letter at my kitchen table, my dog snoring at my feet, and thinking this had to be a joke. When I ignored it, she sent a second notice claiming the HOA had voted to reclaim part of my pasture for shared recreational purposes. That's when I started digging through my father's old files and found the original county land deeds sealed in plastic, complete with a notarized boundary map that made it clear my land extended 20 feet beyond where the HOA had built their precious jogging trail. I made copies and stored them in my truck, knowing full well I might need them soon. Then one Saturday, I woke up to find 2 HOA volunteers pounding wooden stakes into my field, marking off what they said would be a new community picnic zone. That was the day I lost my temper. I walked out there, still in my coffee-stained t-shirt, and asked them who authorized it. They pointed at Karen, standing by her SUV with a smug look, and said she had legal right. I told them to get off my land before I called the sheriff, and she snapped back that she already had. The sheriff came, listened to both sides, and politely told her the matter was civil, not criminal, which didn't sit well with her at all. She filed a complaint with the county, claiming I was a threat to community cohesion. The irony was almost too much. After that, she tried smaller tactics, leaving letters on my gate, blocking my mailbox with HOA flyers, even staging a photo of my tractor obstructing the jogging path. Each attempt failed, but her obsession grew. It all boiled over on that morning when she somehow convinced a few new officers, rookies who didn't know the local maps, to treat her call as legitimate. So when those cruisers arrived and the lead officer barked at me to step aside, I calmly dismounted the mower, pulled the folded deed from my back pocket, and handed it to him. He frowned at it, confused, scanning the seal at the bottom that bore my own signature. I could see the moment his brain made the connection. He knew my name from the courthouse bulletin. His tone softened instantly, but Karen, seeing her plan unravel, started shouting from her SUV, demanding he arrest me anyway. I told him I'd cooperate fully if he could just call dispatch and confirm who I was. He nodded, stepped aside, and made the call. The radio crackled again, and I heard the dispatcher's voice, cheerful and clear. "That's Judge Reynolds you're talking to. He owns that property. Please advise." The silence that followed was beautiful. The officer turned back to me, face pale, and muttered something like, "I'm so sorry, sir," before gesturing awkwardly to his squad car. Karen stormed out of her SUV, yelling that it wasn't possible, that no judge would live next to common homeowners. I didn't even respond. I just pointed to the metal plaque near the gate that bore my name, County Judge Samuel Reynolds, and said, "Next time, you might want to read before you call 911. The rest of the morning felt surreal. The officers apologized and left, Karen fuming in the driveway as the sheriff himself pulled up, tipped his hat to me, and asked if I wanted to press charges for harassment. I declined, not because I wanted peace but because I knew I'd handle this differently. There was a hearing scheduled in 2 weeks regarding the HOA's recent bylaw expansion, and as the presiding judge over that case, I'd have the chance to show them what real accountability looked like. I spent that afternoon repairing the grass they'd torn up, the sun bright over the hills, and I couldn't help but chuckle at the thought that they'd tried to have me arrested for trespassing on my own land. Little did they know, the real trial hadn't even started yet, and I was the one who'd be holding the gavel when the HOA's fate was decided. The days following that absurd arrest attempt were oddly calm on the surface but tense underneath, like a thunderstorm waiting to break. Karen avoided driving past my property, though I could still see her silver SUV parked near the HOA office every morning when I went into town. I figured she was regrouping, plotting her next move, because that woman never let a loss go unchallenged. Meanwhile, the entire neighborhood was buzzing with gossip. Word had spread fast that the HOA tried to arrest a county judge, and while most folks pretended not to take sides, I could tell from the nods and smirks I got at the diner that they knew exactly where they stood. The sheriff stopped by my office 2 days later, chuckling as he handed me a copy of the police report. He said he'd never seen so many conflicting statements in one file. Apparently, Karen had told dispatch I was a rogue squatter impersonating a judge, which made the whole department laugh once they realized who she was talking about. I told him to let it slide for now because I wanted her to dig her own hole deeper before I struck. At the courthouse, things moved fast. The upcoming hearing on the HOA's expansion proposal had been controversial long before this mess. The HOA wanted authority to enforce their rules on all adjacent landowners, not just within their gated boundaries. They called it community preservation, but it was a land grab in disguise, a way to inflate property values and control the aesthetics of everything within sight. Normally, the proposal would have gone through quiet procedural review, but after their stunt, it was clear they were desperate to push it through before I could intervene. I was supposed to recuse myself, but the county board insisted I remain since no other judge was available that month and because the HOA had technically made me part of the dispute by involving law enforcement. I decided to stay on, though I knew it would cause chaos once they found out. That's when I started preparing. I spent my evenings reviewing every document the HOA had filed in the past 2 years, noting the inconsistencies, the inflated invoices, and the signatures that didn't match. The deeper I dug, the clearer it became that Karen's leadership wasn't just petty, it was corrupt. She'd approved funds for landscaping that never happened, fines that had no basis in the bylaws, and payments to contractors who didn't even exist. It was going to be explosive once the hearing began. But before that could happen, she tried one last desperate stunt. 3 days before the hearing, I came home from the courthouse to find a bright orange sticker on my gate reading, "Condemned property, unsafe structure." At first, I thought it was a prank until I saw the county seal. Only it wasn't the real one. She'd printed her own fake version, slightly distorted, but enough to fool a casual glance. I could almost hear her cackling as I peeled it off. I called the county building office to confirm, and they had no record of any condemnation. That was the moment I realized she'd crossed from harassment into forgery. I documented everything, took photos, and quietly sent them to the district attorney's office. I didn't want her arrested yet. I wanted her exposed publicly in front of the very people she manipulated. The next morning, she came strutting up my driveway again, flanked by 2 HOA board members who looked like they regretted being there. She had a file in her hands, waving it dramatically. "Judge Reynolds," she said with a sugary smile, "we've come to offer you a chance to settle this dispute amicably before the hearing. You agree to let us manage the outer perimeter of your land, and we'll withdraw all complaints." I leaned against my fence and let her finish her little performance before asking, "So you're offering me the privilege of surrendering part of my land to an association that doesn't legally exist beyond its gates?" Her smile tightened. "You see, Samuel," she said, using my first name like we were equals, "the community respects order. You being who you are, surely you understand the importance of setting an example." That line nearly made me laugh out loud. I told her I'd think about it and to put her offer in writing. She took the bait immediately, confident she'd cornered me. That night, I received an email from her legal advisor, which turned out to be her nephew, a second-year law student with a Gmail address. He attached a so-called agreement filled with nonsense about shared jurisdiction and visual harmony clauses. I printed it out and added it to my growing folder of evidence. The next morning, I walked into my office, sat at my desk, and drafted a brief summary for the hearing, outlining the HOA's procedural abuses, fraudulent fines, and unapproved document filings. I didn't include my personal encounters, just the facts. The trick was to let them convict themselves through their own arrogance. When the day of the hearing arrived, the courthouse parking lot was packed. HOA members, homeowners, reporters from the local paper, and even a few state officials showed up because word had spread that the county judge himself was at the center of the dispute. I arrived early, wearing my plain gray suit, no robe yet, just another man walking into a storm. Karen was already there, surrounded by her supporters, talking loudly about restoring dignity to the neighborhood. She looked over at me with a smug grin, clearly thinking she still had the upper hand. I greeted her politely, which seemed to throw her off balance. When court convened, I stepped to the bench, the bailiff announced my name, and a wave of murmurs rippled through the crowd as realization hit. Karen hadn't told most of her members that I was the presiding judge. You could see the confusion spreading among them like wildfire. The HOA's lawyer, a nervous-looking man in an ill-fitting suit, stood up first and began reciting their proposal in dry, bureaucratic language. I let him talk, flipping through my notes, waiting for my moment. When he finished, I asked a simple question. "Can you provide the original property boundaries as filed in the county archives?" He hesitated, glancing at Karen, who gave a subtle nod. He produced a map, but it was the altered version I'd seen earlier, the one that included my land inside the HOA's jurisdiction. I asked him to read the date and the recorder's stamp aloud. When he did, the courtroom fell silent because the date was 6 months before the HOA had been legally registered. I leaned forward and said, "So this document claims jurisdiction before your association even existed. Interesting." Karen shifted uncomfortably, whispering to her lawyer, but the damage was done. Then I presented the authentic deed, the one my father had preserved, and handed it to the clerk for verification. The clerk confirmed the seal, the signatures, and the filing year, over 70 years prior to the HOA's creation. Gasps rippled through the room. I kept my tone calm, explaining that any bylaw attempting to override pre-existing property rights was null and void under state law. Karen's composure cracked, her face flushing red as she blurted out that I was using my position to manipulate the system. I told her she was welcome to file an ethics complaint, but for now, the record would show that her association had filed fraudulent documents and attempted to seize private land through false representation. The lawyer looked like he wanted to vanish. As the hearing adjourned, I saw the crowd's faces, half stunned, half delighted. Homeowners who'd been bullied by Karen for years finally had proof that she'd overstepped. Outside the courthouse, a few of them clapped my shoulder, thanking me. I didn't gloat, though deep down it felt satisfying. Karen stormed off without another word, her supporters scattering like leaves in the wind. I knew it wasn't over. People like her never surrendered quietly, but for the first time, the balance had shifted. That night, as I sat on my porch watching the sun dip behind the hills, I could almost feel the tension lift off the land. But there was something in the back of my mind, a quiet certainty that she wasn't done yet, that she'd come back harder and meaner, and next time, she wouldn't come alone. The next week passed like the calm before a storm, deceptively quiet with only the usual sounds of birds, tractors, and distant highway noise cutting through the air, but deep down I knew Karen was plotting something bigger, something that went beyond legal filings or fake county stickers. She was humiliated publicly, and humiliation was a fuel that burned hotter than anger for someone like her. I tried to focus on my work at the courthouse, but every morning I'd catch a glimpse of that silver SUV driving slowly past my gate, like a wolf circling a fence line. The locals were still talking about the hearing, and while most people praised how I'd handled it, a few warned me to be careful because Karen had connections with some developers who weren't exactly known for playing fair. I brushed it off at first, thinking her influence was limited to nosy homeowners and newsletter gossip, but that changed the following Friday when I got a call from the county assessor's office. The voice on the line sounded uneasy as he told me that someone had filed a request to rezone my property under a commercial clause for public access recreation. I froze. That was a developer's trick. Get the zoning changed, then force the owner into compliance or buyout. I asked who filed it, but he hesitated before whispering that the application came from Community Holdings LLC, with Karen's name listed as the local representative. That's when I realized this wasn't just another HOA power trip. She was trying to take my land for good. I drove straight to the assessor's office, still in my work clothes, boots leaving streaks of dirt on the marble floor as I demanded to see the application. The clerk handed me the file, and sure enough, there it was. Maps, forged signatures, and a proposal claiming the land was abandoned for civic redevelopment. They'd attached aerial photos taken by drone, labeled with captions suggesting structural instability and non-compliance with safety codes. I recognized the photos instantly. They were taken from above my barn, right after the renovation when construction materials were still scattered around. I felt a mix of anger and disbelief that they'd stooped this low. I told the clerk to hold the file for evidence and made copies before heading back home. When I pulled into the driveway, my dog started barking furiously, and that's when I saw the "For Sale, Pending Approval" sign staked right beside my gate. It had the same fake HOA logo at the bottom. I ripped it out of the ground, threw it into the truck bed, and took a deep breath to calm myself. She wanted me to react, to lose control, to make a mistake she could exploit later. Not this time. That night, I called Sheriff Dalton and told him everything. He listened quietly, then said something that made my stomach twist. He'd just received an anonymous complaint about unsafe activity on my property, again. Apparently, someone claimed I was illegally storing heavy machinery near residential boundaries, which was nonsense. He said he had to send an inspector by protocol, but he'd handle it discreetly. I appreciated that, though I knew exactly who made the complaint. It was a war of attrition now, and she was testing every angle to make me snap. I decided to get ahead of her. The next morning, I met with the county surveyor, a friend of my late father's, and asked him to prepare an updated certified boundary map, complete with aerial verification and photographic proof. He agreed, promising to expedite it. Then I paid a visit to the newspaper editor, an old-timer named Bill who loved a good story, and gave him the evidence of the forged zoning application. I told him to run the piece only after I gave the signal. Timing was everything. 2 days later, the inspector came by. He was polite, professional, and clearly uncomfortable, glancing around my property as if expecting something illegal to pop out of the bushes. I showed him the equipment, a single tractor, 2 trailers, and a stack of lumber neatly arranged by the shed. He nodded, took notes, and muttered that everything looked fine. Before leaving, he lowered his voice and said, "For what it's worth, Judge, this report came from her directly. She's been calling every department in the county." I thanked him, shaking his hand, and told him to keep his head down because this was going to get messy. That evening, as the sun dipped low and painted the pasture gold, I noticed 2 figures standing by the edge of the HOA's jogging trail with what looked like surveying equipment. I walked over calmly, asking what they were doing. One of them, a young man in a reflective vest, said they were contractors hired by Community Holdings to conduct preliminary grading assessments. I asked if they had a permit, and they hesitated before showing me a printed document stamped with an obviously fake seal. I told them to pack up their gear and leave before I called the sheriff. They complied quickly, mumbling something about just following orders. I watched them drive off, dust trailing behind them, and for the first time I realized Karen had probably convinced investors that the land deal was legitimate. She wasn't just bluffing anymore, she was selling something she didn't own. I stayed up late that night, sipping coffee on the porch, thinking through my next move. If I went after her now, she'd cry persecution and spin it into a sympathy campaign. But if I let her go too far, innocent buyers could get trapped in her scam. I decided to use her arrogance against her again. The upcoming county board meeting was in 3 days, and rezoning requests were always discussed publicly. I called Bill, the editor, and told him to have a reporter attend the meeting and bring a camera. Then I drafted a statement outlining the false documents, fraudulent signatures, and the LLC's lack of registration. I didn't sign it as Judge Reynolds. I signed it simply as a private landowner. It had to look like the community itself was uncovering her deception, not me from behind a bench. When the day arrived, the boardroom was packed again, though this time the energy was different. Karen showed up wearing a bright red blazer, smiling like a politician, with a man beside her in a tailored suit who looked every inch the slick developer type. She took the podium and began her pitch, talking about revitalization, ecotourism, and community enrichment. Her tone was rehearsed, full of fake warmth. But as she spoke, I could see small cracks forming. She was nervous. When she finished, the board chair thanked her and called for public comment. That's when I stood up from the back row, holding the file in my hand. The room fell quiet. I walked to the front, introduced myself plainly, and began reading from the zoning request, then paused, looked directly at the developer, and asked, "Did you verify this representative's authority over the land in question?" He frowned, glancing at Karen, who stiffened instantly. I handed the clerk a copy of my certified deed and the surveyor's report, then turned back to the crowd. "For the record, this property has been privately owned and registered in my family for over 70 years. Any claims of abandonment or sale authorization are false." A murmur swept through the audience. The developer took a step back from Karen, clearly blindsided. The board chair looked uneasy and asked Karen if she had documentation to support her claim. She stammered, rummaging through her folder, but all she had were the fake copies I'd already exposed. The chair finally said they'd postpone any decision pending investigation, which was bureaucratic code for shutting it down. As I walked back to my seat, Karen's face was pale, her eyes darting between the cameras and her so-called investor. The reporter caught every second. I didn't smile or gloat. I just sat quietly while the meeting adjourned. When I left the building, Bill's reporter was already outside calling in the headline, HOA president accused of land fraud during county meeting. That night, I drove home under the stars, exhausted but satisfied. I knew she wouldn't go quietly after a public humiliation like that, but I also knew something had shifted permanently. The facade she'd built around control and authority was cracking, and soon everyone would see what she truly was. Still, part of me couldn't shake the uneasy feeling that I'd only cornered her, not defeated her. People like Karen didn't back down. They adapted, regrouped, and came back sharper. I just didn't know yet how far she'd go to strike back, or how dangerous her next move would be. 3 days after the county meeting, I woke up to the sound of heavy machinery idling somewhere near my fence line, the kind of low mechanical growl that makes your stomach tighten because it doesn't belong there. I threw on my boots, grabbed my phone, and walked out to find a backhoe and 2 dump trucks parked halfway up the dirt road that bordered my property. A crew of men in reflective vests were unloading concrete blocks and steel pipes, clearly preparing for something big. When I asked what they were doing, one of them, a middle-aged foreman with a clipboard, told me they were starting Phase 1 of the Community Water Retention Project. I asked him who authorized it, and he replied without hesitation, "The HOA, sir, and their project manager, Mrs. Karen Douglas." For a long second I didn't say a word, just stared at him, letting the silence do the work. Then I said quietly, "You're standing on private county-registered land that doesn't belong to the HOA or anyone else but me." The man looked confused, checking his papers again, then asked if I could show proof. I told him to hold tight and walked back to the house, returning with the laminated copy of the county map, signed by the surveyor just a week earlier. He looked at it, looked back at the road, and sighed. "I had a feeling something was off," he said. "We've had weird instructions from her all week." I thanked him and told him to leave the materials where they were until the sheriff verified the situation. Within 30 minutes, Sheriff Dalton's truck rolled up, and after one glance at the forged permit papers the crew had been given, he whistled under his breath. "She's getting bold now," he muttered. "This isn't just fraud anymore, Sam. This is illegal construction." He took photos, radioed for a county investigator, and promised to shut it down. By noon, Karen showed up, stepping out of her SUV like a general arriving at the front lines. Her sunglasses couldn't hide the fury on her face. She marched straight toward us, shouting that I had no right to interfere with community improvement. Dalton turned to her and said flatly, "Ma'am, you're trespassing, and these workers were operating on private land under false authorization." She didn't even flinch, just started reciting lines about public benefit and shared water management rights. I stood quietly beside the sheriff until she finished her speech, then asked her one question. "Who signed your permit?" She blinked, clearly not expecting that. The foreman handed over the document, and I pointed to the fake seal again, the same one she'd used on the condemnation sticker. "You're forging county seals now," I said, my tone steady but sharp enough to cut through the heat. "That's a felony, Karen." Her expression shifted from anger to panic for just a moment before she snapped back into defiance. "You think you can scare me with your title? You're abusing your power," she yelled. Dalton told her to calm down or face detainment, and she finally turned on her heel and stormed back to her SUV, tires spitting gravel as she sped off. The crew packed up quickly, leaving the equipment behind since the trucks were county rentals. Dalton shook his head and said, "She's going to hang herself with this rope. Just keep documenting everything." That evening, I sat on my porch staring at the half-dug ditch she'd ordered, the smell of diesel still hanging in the air. The whole thing felt surreal, like she'd lost all sense of limit. But then my phone buzzed. An email from an anonymous address with the subject, "You won't get away with this." Inside was a single sentence, "Enjoy your position while it lasts, Judge." Attached was a blurry photo of me standing on my porch earlier that day. My chest tightened. Someone had been watching me. I saved the email, forwarded it to the sheriff, and installed extra lights around the property that night. Still, sleep didn't come easy. Every snapping twig outside sounded like footsteps. The next morning, a news van was parked by the main road. The reporter, the same one from the board meeting, waved and asked for a comment about the latest HOA scandal. I declined politely but handed her copies of the county report that confirmed the forged documents. "If you want to help," I said, "print the truth." By that afternoon, the headline was everywhere. HOA president under investigation for forgery and illegal construction. The fallout was immediate. Several HOA members resigned, neighbors started demanding an emergency election, and Karen went into hiding for a day. But she wasn't finished. The following night, she appeared live on a local podcast run by a sympathetic friend, spinning a wild narrative about corrupt officials and powerful men silencing community voices. She claimed the entire thing was a setup to discredit her, and even hinted that I'd been personally targeting her for years. It would have been laughable if it wasn't so dangerously manipulative. Within hours, social media pages lit up with comments, some defending me, others calling me part of a conspiracy. It was chaos, and that was exactly what she wanted. I decided to stay silent publicly and let the legal process do the talking. The district attorney's office opened a formal inquiry, and soon subpoenas started flying. I was careful to avoid any direct involvement to prevent conflict of interest, but privately, I made sure the investigators had every piece of evidence I'd collected. Meanwhile, strange things kept happening around the property. One morning, I found tire tracks leading into my north pasture, ending near the creek where someone had dumped bags of garbage and broken HOA signs. Another time, my mailbox was stuffed with copies of anonymous complaints addressed to Judge Fraud. Even my courthouse parking spot got vandalized once, a red spray-painted word across the asphalt, "Thief." It was childish, but it showed she was unraveling. Then came the twist I didn't see coming. One afternoon, the sheriff called and told me the county office had received a cease and desist letter from a law firm representing Community Holdings LLC, the same company she'd used earlier. But this time, the letter wasn't about rezoning. It was a notice of pending civil action against me personally for defamation and obstruction of community development. I almost laughed when he read it, but then he said the firm attached an affidavit from a supposed investor claiming I'd threatened them during the board meeting. That was serious. I immediately called a lawyer friend of mine, Martin, who specialized in civil defense. He reviewed the documents and confirmed what I suspected. Every signature, every stamp, every address on that letter was part of an elaborate facade. The law firm existed only on paper, registered under a shell company that traced back to Karen's cousin in another state. "She's playing a dangerous game," Martin said. "If she keeps filing fake claims, she's looking at jail time." I nodded, feeling a mix of anger and exhaustion. I didn't want to destroy her life, but she was leaving me no choice. 2 days later, the sheriff called again, this time with news that made my pulse race. They'd found surveillance cameras hidden in the trees near my fence, small wireless models aimed directly at my house. The county tech team traced the feed to a private IP registered to the HOA's community server. That meant someone inside the HOA was still helping her, feeding her information. Dalton asked if I wanted to press charges immediately, but I told him to hold off until we identified everyone involved. I wanted the entire network exposed, not just the figurehead. That night, as rain started falling softly over the fields, I sat by the window watching the headlights of distant cars move along the ridge road. Every so often, lightning illuminated the half-dug trench she'd ordered, now filling with muddy water, a perfect metaphor for the mess she'd created. I couldn't shake the feeling that something bigger was coming, that all these moves were leading to one final confrontation. She'd tried law, lies, and intimidation, and failed. The only card left was desperation, and desperate people were the most dangerous kind. Rain had fallen all night, heavy and relentless, turning the dirt road into a river of brown sludge and filling the unfinished trench near my fence with dark water that reflected the gray morning sky like a mirror. I stood on my porch with a cup of coffee in hand, watching the mist drift over the pasture while my dog paced nervously at my feet, ears twitching at every distant sound. There was an eerie stillness to the air, the kind that comes before something breaks loose, and I could feel in my gut that today would not be peaceful. Around 9, a black SUV I didn't recognize pulled up near the gate, tires spinning in the mud, and 3 men stepped out wearing cheap suits and smug expressions that screamed hired trouble. The tallest one introduced himself as Mr. Brandt, representing Community Holdings LLC, and waved a stack of papers like a badge of authority. He said they were there to deliver an official notice of property claim enforcement. I didn't move from the porch. I asked him calmly if he was aware the company he claimed to represent was under criminal investigation for document fraud, but he just smiled and said they were acting under new ownership. Behind him, one of the men started filming with his phone, narrating something about an aggressive landowner resisting lawful process. It was obvious they were staging another setup, probably for social media or the HOA's internal newsletter. I let them talk for a bit, sipping my coffee, then told them to leave before the sheriff arrived. They laughed at first until they heard the familiar crunch of tires on gravel. Sheriff Dalton's pickup appeared through the mist, and their confidence evaporated instantly. Dalton stepped out, hand resting casually on his belt, and asked for identification. None of them could provide any credentials beyond those forged papers. Within minutes, he ordered them off the property and radioed for deputies to follow their vehicle until they left county limit. Once they were gone, Dalton turned to me, shaking his head. "She's getting other people involved now," he said. "That means she's running out of moves." I agreed, but I could see the fatigue in his eyes. This feud was spreading like wildfire, dragging in officials, residents, and now even strangers. I told him about the security footage I'd found, small flashes of headlights near the old barn around midnight 2 nights in a row. He promised to send a deputy for night patrols until things cooled down. Still, something told me cooling down wasn't on Karen's agenda. By afternoon, I received another email, this time from a news outlet in a neighboring county, requesting a comment on claims of judicial misconduct involving HOA property disputes. I didn't even have to read the full message to know she'd started feeding lies to outside media. The headline practically wrote itself: "Judge accused of land grab," and even though I knew the truth would prevail, I also knew perception mattered. Small towns thrived on gossip, and once a rumor started rolling, it didn't stop until someone crushed it publicly. So I decided to fight back not with words, but with proof. I spent the next 2 days compiling every document, photo, video, and statement I had collected since the first encounter. I arranged them chronologically in a thick binder labeled the HOA file, cross-referencing each fake signature with verified county record. By the time I finished, my dining table looked like a crime lab. Martin, my lawyer friend, came by to review it and whistled low. "This is airtight," he said. "Once we submit this, she's finished. There's enough here to open a grand jury investigation." I nodded but hesitated. Part of me still wanted her to stop before it came to that, to realize she was standing at the edge of a cliff and step back. But Karen wasn't the type to back down gracefully. The breaking point came 2 nights later when I woke to the sound of engines roaring outside. I jumped up, grabbed my flashlight, and ran to the porch. Headlights cut through the rain as 2 pickup trucks sped past my gate and skidded to a stop in the pasture near the trench. My dog barked furiously. I could barely make out silhouettes moving around in the dark, carrying something that clanged against metal. I shouted for them to stop, but one of them yelled back something unintelligible before dropping what looked like a barrel into the flooded ditch. I didn't wait to find out what they were doing. I called Dalton immediately. Within 10 minutes, sirens echoed through the valley, and the intruders scrambled into their trucks, speeding off into the night. When the deputies arrived, they found 3 steel drums partially submerged, leaking some kind of chemical-smelling sludge. The environmental officer identified it as waste oil, likely dumped there to make it look like I was polluting county land. Karen had crossed a new line: environmental sabotage. I stood in the rain watching as they sealed the area with tape, fury burning in my chest. Dalton turned to me and said, "We're charging her this time, Sam. No more warnings." The next morning, the sheriff's department executed a search warrant on the HOA office. I drove into town just in time to see Karen standing on the curb, arms crossed, shouting at the deputies as they carried out boxes of files and computers. The look on her face when she saw me across the street was something I'll never forget, a twisted mix of rage, disbelief, and fear. She shouted that I'd ruined her life, that I'd abused my position to destroy her reputation. I didn't respond. There was nothing left to say. The law would handle what words couldn't. That afternoon, the DA officially filed charges for forgery, fraud, illegal surveillance, and environmental violations. The local news ran the story by evening, and this time there was no sympathetic spin. Just cold, hard facts supported by evidence. HOA members lined up to resign, claiming they had no idea what she'd been doing behind the scenes. For the first time in months, I felt a small sense of relief, though I knew it wasn't over until the case was closed. That night, I sat in my office, the rain finally easing outside, flipping through the binder one last time. The pages told a story of arrogance meeting accountability, of someone who thought they could twist rules to suit their ego until they ran into a wall built from truth. Yet, even as I looked at the evidence, I couldn't help but wonder what had driven her so far. Was it greed, pride, or just the need to control everything around her? The question hung in my mind like fog as I shut the binder and turned off the lamp. Outside, the moon broke through the clouds, casting silver light across the wet fields. The trench, now filled with rainwater, glimmered quietly like a scar in the land, a reminder of the chaos that had unfolded. I knew the court date would come soon, and when it did, the courtroom would be packed again. Only this time, Karen wouldn't be the one making accusations, she'd be the one answering them. But deep down, a nagging thought refused to leave me alone. People like Karen didn't accept defeat easily. The moment the charges hit, she'd lost her power, her influence, her mask of authority, and that kind of loss can push a person past reason. I checked the locks twice that night before going to bed, the dog sleeping at the foot of the door. Somewhere out there in the dark, I could almost feel her presence, watching, waiting, planning her last desperate move. And I had the sinking feeling that before this was truly over, she'd try one final act of revenge that would test just how much I was willing to protect what was mine. The days leading up to the trial were unnervingly quiet, too quiet for a situation that had spiraled this far, and I knew better than to mistake silence for peace. The rain had dried, the fields had hardened again, and the trench Karen once tried to claim as her community water project now lay still, half filled with murky water that reflected the clear blue sky like an eye watching everything. I went about my daily work at the courthouse as usual, reviewing unrelated cases, keeping a neutral tone whenever anyone brought up the HOA mess, but every so often, someone would stop by my office to shake my hand and whisper that they were rooting for me. Even the janitor, an old man who'd worked there for 30 years, muttered that it was about time someone put those clipboard tyrants in their place. I appreciated the support, but part of me stayed wary. Karen had been silent since the raid. No calls, no emails, no SUV creeping past the gate, but that was exactly why I didn't trust it. People like her didn't disappear, they regrouped. Sure enough, 2 nights before the court date, something strange happened. Around midnight, my dog started barking wildly again, louder than before. I grabbed my flashlight and stepped out onto the porch. The night was still, the moon bright, but the far end of my pasture glowed faintly, too orange, too steady to be moonlight. I ran toward it, heart pounding, and when I reached the edge of the barn, I saw the flames licking up from the pile of lumber I'd stored for the fencing project. Someone had doused it in fuel. The air smelled like gasoline and smoke mixed with damp earth. I grabbed the hose and started spraying, shouting for my neighbor Carson to call the fire department. We managed to control it before it spread to the barn, but by the time the fire trucks arrived, most of the wood was ash. The firefighters confirmed what I already knew. It was arson. Dalton showed up not long after, his face grim as he surveyed the scene. "She's not letting go, Sam," he said. "This is personal now." I nodded, jaw tight. I didn't need proof to know who had ordered it. But proof I would get. The next morning, Dalton's deputies found a half-burned gas can in the ditch near the trail that led back toward the HOA. Fingerprints were partial, but there was enough residue on the handle to suggest someone who'd handled oil before. It wasn't Karen's direct doing, but it had her style all over it, getting someone else to do the dirty work. Despite the fire, I refused to cancel the court hearing. It was scheduled for Thursday morning, and by then, the whole town knew what was coming. When I arrived at the courthouse, the air buzzed with tension. Reporters lined the sidewalk, cameras flashing as I walked in through the side entrance. The DA was already inside, reviewing notes with his team. On the other side of the room sat Karen, in a beige suit that probably used to make her look respectable but now only emphasized how drained she looked. Her hair was slightly unkempt, her hands fidgeting with a pen she never stopped clicking. Behind her sat a new lawyer, young and overly confident, clearly hired at the last minute. The moment our eyes met, she gave me a look that was half fury, half exhaustion, like a gambler down to her last chip. The bailiff called for order, and the DA began laying out the charges: fraud, forgery, environmental contamination, harassment, and unlawful surveillance. Every word landed like a hammer, and I could see her shrinking just a little more with each one. Her lawyer tried to object, claiming misunderstanding and procedural error, but the evidence was too overwhelming. When the DA presented the security footage of the HOA server's access logs and the fake zoning paperwork, the courtroom went silent except for the sound of shuffling papers. Then came the part I'd been waiting for: the witness statements. The foreman from the construction crew testified about how she had instructed them to begin work without permit. 2 HOA members admitted they'd been pressured into signing false minutes of meetings to cover her track. Even her nephew, the amateur legal advisor, confessed she'd asked him to forge documents for the good of the community. Each testimony chipped away at the image she'd built for years, that perfect suburban authority figure who believed rules were her personal weapons. When the DA finished, her lawyer called her to the stand. She hesitated, then stood, walking to the witness chair with a stiff smile that fooled no one. Under oath, she began her speech, a twisted monologue about being a victim of institutional bias and vindictive overreach. She spoke of her love for the community, how she only wanted to protect the neighborhood from decline, and how certain individuals had turned everyone against her. I watched silently, hands folded, as she turned toward the jury, her voice trembling at the edges of self-pity. It might have worked if the evidence hadn't already buried her. When the DA cross-examined her, he asked a single question that unraveled everything. "Mrs. Douglas, if your actions were purely for community benefit, why did your LLC receive 3 separate payments totaling $75,000 from the HOA maintenance fund?" She froze. The silence was painful. Her lawyer fumbled, whispering frantically, but it was too late. The DA handed the jury bank statements showing deposits into her personal account labeled "consulting fees." A murmur spread through the courtroom. She tried to deny it, then pivoted to blame her accountant, but the damage was irreversible. Within an hour, her credibility collapsed entirely. The hearing concluded with the DA recommending immediate indictment pending final review. As the bailiff called recess, I caught one last glimpse of her slumped at the table, face pale, eyes unfocused. It wasn't victory I felt. It was something colder, something like pity mixed with relief. Outside, reporters swarmed the steps, microphones thrust forward, shouting questions about corruption and revenge. I said nothing, just kept walking toward my truck while the sheriff's deputies escorted Karen out the side entrance in handcuffs. The town had waited months for this, and the sight of her being led away marked the end of a long, bitter chapter. But as I drove home, past the same field she'd tried to claim, I couldn't shake the weight sitting in my chest. Power had corrupted her completely, and in some way, the community had enabled it by looking the other way for too long. That night, I sat by the window again, the dog curled beside me, the sky clear for the first time in weeks. The moonlight glimmered on the pond near the old trench, turning it silver and calm. Everything was still, but my mind kept replaying her last words in court, a quiet line she'd muttered as the deputies took her away. "You'll regret making me your enemy." It wasn't a threat shouted in anger, it was whispered, almost like a promise. I poured another cup of coffee and stared into the darkness outside, wondering if I was finally free of her chaos or if the damage she'd done would ripple long after she was gone. Somewhere far off, a coyote howled, and the sound echoed through the valley like a warning. I didn't answer it. I just sat there, silent, waiting for morning, knowing the story wasn't quite over yet, but for now, at least, justice had finally caught up to her. The following weeks felt like stepping out of a long storm into uncertain sunlight, the kind where everything looks peaceful but the ground is still wet and slippery beneath your feet. The courthouse had returned to its usual rhythm, my docket filled with routine cases again, and for the first time in months, my phone didn't buzz with HOA nonsense or anonymous threat. Karen's name had become the talk of every coffee shop and grocery line, her downfall spreading through the county like wildfire, but I didn't take pleasure in it. I'd seen what unchecked ego and obsession could do to people, and behind all her madness, there had been a very real desperation to control something she didn't understand. Still, justice had taken its course, and I thought maybe now, finally, I could move on. The sheriff assured me she was being held pending trial, her bail denied because of the flight risk she posed after investigators discovered she'd tried to transfer money out of her personal account to an offshore one just days before her arrest. Yet deep inside, I couldn't relax. There was always that shadow of doubt that she still had a card left to play, some hidden piece of leverage waiting to be used. It turned out my instinct wasn't wrong. One Thursday afternoon, 2 weeks after her detention, I received a call from the county clerk informing me that a mysterious package had been delivered to the courthouse addressed to me, with no return name but bearing the HOA's old office address as the sender. My stomach tightened as I told them not to open it until the sheriff's office could inspect it. Within an hour, Dalton and his team were there, handling it carefully like it might explode. When they opened the box, it wasn't a bomb but a pile of files, hundreds of printed emails, copies of property documents, and a USB drive labeled HOA Secrets. It was a last desperate act, an attempt by someone loyal to Karen to stir up chaos by implying there was a bigger conspiracy. The USB contained recordings of HOA meetings, some legitimate, others clearly edited to sound incriminating. One file had a distorted voice claiming I'd been part of a land deal years ago that benefited me unfairly. It was sloppy, laughably fake, but I knew she was trying to smear me one last time from inside her cell, to poison the court of public opinion if she couldn't win the legal one. Dalton grunted after reviewing the material, saying, "She's not done playing. She wants attention, even if it buries her deeper." We turned the files over to the DA, who confirmed it was part of a larger investigation into several false evidence submissions tied back to her old associates. Despite the drama, life slowly found balance again. The county board officially dissolved the HOA pending reformation, and for the first time in years, homeowners could breathe without fear of fines for mailbox paint colors or lawn length. I even saw a few of them smiling at each other again, instead of glaring from behind their hedges. Mr. Carson stopped by one afternoon with a bottle of bourbon and said, "You know, Judge, for someone who never wanted to be a hero, you sure ended up one." I laughed, telling him I hadn't been heroic at all, just tired of nonsense. But his words stayed with me. Maybe people needed to see that bullies, even in polite suburban clothes, could be stopped when someone stood up. I thought that might be the end of the story, until one night, near sunset, when I heard a familiar voice calling from my gate. It was a younger woman, maybe in her late 20s, dressed simply, standing beside an old sedan with the engine still running. She introduced herself as Laura Douglas, Karen's daughter. My pulse skipped. She looked nothing like her mother, softer features, tired eyes, but there was a spark of grief and confusion behind them. She said she just wanted to talk. Against my better judgment, I invited her to the porch. She told me she hadn't spoken to her mother in years, not since the HOA obsession began, but after seeing the news she needed to understand why everything had happened. She wasn't always like this, Laura said quietly. When Dad left, she lost everything that gave her control. Then the HOA became her world. She thought if she could control that, she could control her life again. Her voice trembled. I know she did terrible things, but I also know she thought she was saving something. I listened, silent for a while, letting the weight of her words sink in. It didn't excuse Karen's actions, but it made her seem more human than the villain she'd become in my mind. Laura thanked me before leaving, saying she planned to visit her mother in jail to tell her to stop fighting and accept what was coming. As her car disappeared down the road, I realized the story wasn't just about revenge or justice anymore. It was about how pride, left unchecked, can destroy everything it touches. The next morning, Dalton called again, his tone grave. "We've got a situation," he said. "Karen's in the hospital." My breath caught. Apparently, she'd collapsed during a court transfer after complaining of chest pain. The doctors said it was exhaustion and stress compounded by high blood pressure. She wasn't dying, but she was fragile. I didn't know what to feel, relief, sympathy, maybe both. Part of me wanted to visit her, to close this chapter face to face, but another part knew it would only reopen old wounds. Still, a few days later, curiosity won. I stopped by the hospital after hours, signing in quietly and asking the nurse if I could see her. She hesitated but nodded, leading me down a dim hallway. Karen was awake, propped up against the pillow, foreline in her arm, staring out the window at the rain. When she saw me, her expression flickered between surprise and resentment. "Come to gloat," she whispered. I shook my head and said I'd come to make sure she was all right. For a long time, we sat in silence, the sound of the heart monitor ticking softly in the background. Finally, she spoke, her voice quieter than I'd ever heard it. "You know, I didn't hate you at first. I just couldn't stand that you were beyond my reach. You didn't answer to anyone, and that terrified me. I thought if I could make you bend, everyone else would follow." I didn't interrupt. She looked down at her hands and added, "But I didn't realize until too late that I was the one bending to my own obsession." When I left the hospital that night, the air was cool and still, the storm having passed again. I felt something shift inside me, not forgiveness, not entirely, but closure. She'd been broken by her own ambition, and there was nothing more the law could do to her that life hadn't already done. The next morning, the DA called to confirm that Karen had officially accepted a plea deal, avoiding a lengthy trial in exchange for full cooperation with the investigation into her accomplices. The HOA's assets would be liquidated to repay fines, and she would serve time with probation afterward. The saga that had consumed nearly a year of my life was finally ending, not with another explosion or act of vengeance, but with quiet surrender. As I drove home that evening, the sun set behind the hills, bathing the fields in a warm golden light. The trench by the fence had dried completely, the soil cracking gently under the breeze, and I realized that even the scars left behind by chaos eventually fade. For the first time in months, I let myself smile, not because I'd won, but because it was finally over. The months that followed passed in quiet rhythm, and the town slowly forgot the chaos that had consumed it, though the traces of the ordeal still lingered in subtle ways, like faint burn marks that never completely fade from wood. The HOA office had been sold, its sign taken down, and the once fearful homeowners had reorganized into a new neighborhood association with actual transparency. My days settled into something resembling peace again. I'd wake early, make coffee, and walk the property line with my dog as the morning sun rose over the ridge. The trench Karen's crew once dug had been filled, leveled, and grass had begun to sprout, reclaiming what was damaged. Yet sometimes I'd stop there, hands in my pockets, and think about how strange it was that one person's hunger for control had turned this quiet piece of land into a battlefield. It wasn't anger I felt anymore, just reflection, an understanding that power, even the smallest kind, can twist good intentions when it isn't kept in check. Karen was serving her sentence, and from what the sheriff told me, she'd been assigned light work detail at a nearby county facility. She wasn't dangerous enough to be locked away completely, but too unpredictable to be left unsupervised. The DA had closed her case with a note of partial cooperation, since she'd provided testimony that helped uncover a few minor corruption ties between her developer partner and another county. Her daughter Laura occasionally sent updates through the sheriff's office, short letters thanking me for not letting things spiral into bitterness. I never wrote back, but I read every one of them, each line carrying a strange mixture of apology and closure. One morning, I received a small envelope in the mail addressed in Laura's handwriting. Inside was a photograph of Karen sitting at a bench under a tree, dressed in plain clothes, reading a book. On the back she'd written, "She says she finally understands." I stared at that photo for a long time, unsure whether it stirred relief or sadness. Life at the courthouse resumed its usual routine. People still whispered occasionally about the HOA incident, especially whenever new disputes came across my desk, but most had moved on to fresher gossip. Even so, something in me had changed permanently. I'd spent years interpreting the law through detached logic, separating emotion from judgment, but this experience had blurred that line. Justice, I realized, wasn't just about laws. It was about protecting ordinary peace, the kind that people take for granted until someone threatens it. When you lose that peace, every small sound at night starts to feel like danger. I understood now why some neighbors had tolerated Karen for so long. It wasn't agreement, it was exhaustion. It's easier to stay quiet than confront those who shout the loudest. But silence is the soil where bullies grow. One evening, as summer faded into autumn, the county held a community event in the town square, a kind of symbolic reset. They'd invited me to say a few words since I'd become the unintended centerpiece of the story that had defined the year. I didn't want to give a grand speech, so I just said what I meant. I told them that land wasn't just soil or property lines, it was trust. Every rule, every map, every fence we draw means nothing if people forget decency. The crowd was quiet for a moment, then they clapped, not for me, I think, but for the relief of closure. Afterward, a few homeowners approached me to share how much calmer life had become without constant HOA pressure. One of them even joked that they were finally repainting their front door without worrying about a fine. That small laughter felt like the real victory. When I got home that night, the air was cool and smelled faintly of pine. The porch light buzzed softly, and I sat down with my old notebook, the one I'd filled with evidence and notes during the ordeal. I flipped through it slowly, page by page, remembering every step of the battle. There were photos of the false condemnation sticker, copies of her fake permits, handwritten notes about each confrontation. At the end of the notebook, there was a blank page. I picked up my pen and wrote one final line, "Peace reclaimed." Then I closed it, set it on the shelf, and decided to leave it there as a reminder, not of what had happened, but of what it had cost. A few months later, the sheriff stopped by while on patrol. He leaned against the railing, sipping coffee from a thermos, and said, "You know, Sam, it's strange not hearing from her anymore. Feels like the county got quieter." I nodded and said, "Maybe that's how we know we did our jobs right." He laughed, said something about me finally getting to enjoy retirement years in advance, then tipped his hat and drove off. The sound of his tires faded down the road, leaving only the chirping of crickets and the wind brushing through the trees. I realized I hadn't heard a siren near this road in months, hadn't seen a single flyer or demand notice, hadn't woken to anxiety. It felt good, ordinary, peaceful, undeservedly simple. Winter came slowly that year, with frost painting the fields white by dawn. One morning, I walked down to the edge of the creek and saw that the water line had shifted slightly from the rains. I took out the old deed map, more out of habit than worry, and smiled at how precise my father's boundaries still were. Everything was in order. I thought of him then, how he'd built this place with his hands, never knowing one day I'd have to defend it in court against a self-appointed tyrant. He used to say, "Land doesn't care who owns it, son. It only remembers who respects it." Standing there, I finally understood what he meant. That night, I built a fire in the fireplace, opened a bottle of that bourbon Mr. Carson had brought, and poured 2 glasses even though I was alone. One for me, one for everything that had been endured and overcome. I raised the second glass in a quiet toast to no one in particular, to peace, to patience, to lessons learned the hard way. Outside, the wind rustled through the trees, carrying with it the distant sound of laughter from a few homes across the valley. The community had healed in its own quiet way, and so had I. For the first time in what felt like forever, I went to bed without checking the locks twice, without glancing toward the gate or wondering who might drive up the road. I slept soundly through the night, dreaming not of courtrooms or sirens, but of sunlight on open fields, and in that dream, the world was calm again, exactly the way it should have been from the start.